Regulatory Director at Fenestration Canada. Adrian's learned more about tariffs in the last 2 months than this entire room knows. Well, maybe not quite, but he's definitely dug into it and really spent a significant amount of time reaching out across the country, connecting with people that that can help our association and our members work their way through this current situation that we're in. So, Adrian, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. I'll admit, when I joined with Fen Canada, managing tariffs was definitely not top of my list. That I think 5-6 months ago, I was kind of hoping at this point we'd be talking about simplifying building codes and getting a bit deeper into how we manage our standards better. But I would say the tariffs definitely provided a fair emergency for us to be a bit more hands-on. And as I've been saying for the last, 2 months, don't let a perfectly good conflict go to waste. So here we are. So I spent the first bit of this presentation trying to decide which historical reference to give you guys. I think tariffs are interesting in the sense that we've had them since written history for humans. That trade wars and how we've been managing trade relationships, honestly, oftentimes have come down to how the tariffs have been set up between nation states. I looked at the Napoleonic Wars. That's a good one for just like this hard trade war between a conquering nation. Obviously, the Great Depression had Smoot and Hawley, so that was great material because that's very similar. I decided I was going to break away a little bit from, call it, direct historical lessons, and we're going to talk a little bit more about NAFTA instead. That I think that's a good one for us to go back and look at some of the fair trade agreements and how we got here and what's it doing for us at the moment. So next we'll go through and I'm just going to give you guys a rundown of where the tariffs are. So anybody that's been watching it, obviously it's really challenging to figure out who is who in the zoo. I mean, even as of, I think this was 2 days ago, I got a little bit more of an update on the softwood side of the tariffs that I'll kind of explain just briefly. And then I'll go through a variety of, call it, lessons learned that I've gathered from different experts on how you can manage the border, what to expect, how things have changed. And then I'll give really just one slide on kind of where Fen Canada is in this conversation, what we've done, what you can expect from us moving forward. So yeah, let's just jump right into maybe there we go into NAFTA. So NAFTA was set up in 1994 between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. Mexico's intention was they had a series of factories or maquiladora zones that were opening up and they were looking for additional investment. So this was a great way to convince the U.S. to kind of come to the table and provide investors that wanted to go that path. They were also offering to act as a portal for Central and South American materials to come into the U.S. and Canada. Then the U.S. wanted better presence as far as kind of that staging between the three countries. They wanted those resources, and they also were seeing competition from the EU and Japan in a way they hadn't seen before, and so they needed to find better competition. And then Canada, we kind of came to the table with, we'd like a good rules-based system that allows us to tap into the US market, and we would like to diversify that market because at the time, we were at 82% of our trade with just the US. So the idea was that if we got into the NAFTA agreement, we'd actually be able to break that out a little bit further into North America. Full stop, we are now at 78% dominant trade with the US. So this whole idea of diversification, I obviously I'm kind of giving away the story at the end of NAFTA, but we kind of failed at that particular element. So I'm going to give 3 different stories. First in Mexico, then in Canada, and then in the US, just so you can kind of get a feel for like a human story of what's gone on since 1994 when it comes to this free trade agreement. So I read a handful of good stories in Mexico, but one that specifically caught me was a woman named Anna. So she was living in a farming community in Oaxaca. And at 19, she gets an opportunity to come into one of the Maquiladora zones and start working at the factory. So that's working great for the first year or so. Wages are good. She's able to send money back home. There's a bit of flexibility. But about 5 years in, wages haven't changed, and the area that she's living in becomes more expensive, and then she winds up kind of in this exploitive state where she's in indentured servitude, where she's working 12 plus hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. And that just became kind of the story for NAFTA for a lot of these factory workers. They got stuck. They couldn't go back to the farm. They didn't have enough money to leave. So then we get into Canada, and honestly, the big conversation in Canada was instability, and specifically with soft lumber. So the story that I've got is a guy named Mark, and Mark takes over his parents' or his family's soft lumber mill in northern BC, and everything is great right at the beginning. He's got good exports, money's coming in. But tariffs start on soft lumber in 2001, come on, come off, come on, come off. And my favorite quote from him is, "I was trying to build a house in a hurricane." He was constantly firing and rehiring people throughout the process. And then last is the US. So I had quite a few stories in the US that I thought were interesting. And John was probably my favorite, where he's got a family farm that's producing corn. He's told at a little under 30 that his farm's now going to have access to the entire North American continent. He's going to have a lot more money coming in, and that was true. He did great for the first 3 or 4 years, and then you've got these giant agro businesses that came in and essentially starved all the smaller to medium-sized farmers out of their participation in the market. And so now they've had to either diversify, they've been bought out, or they find themselves with debts to large companies trying to buy the materials, and they find themselves in indentured servitude. So I kind of started here because oftentimes the conversation when it came to free trade was that it's flawed. I would say the one thing with the Trump administration, I completely agree. The free trade agreement isn't working. But I don't think the U.S. were the only ones that got screwed on that deal. Unfortunately, I think the exploitation in the U.S. was potentially as bad or close to as those in Mexico. For us, it's just been instability. We just didn't get what we wanted out of the deal, which was we didn't diversify and we didn't get stable trade with the U.S. So I leave that because I think there's a bigger conversation about rethinking how these relationships work. At the core of their problems, it's a governance problem, in my view. And admittedly, when NAFTA was renegotiated, it didn't actually solve the problem. What you wound up with was new labor laws in Mexico, which weren't actually acted upon. It was a lot of, call it, face value changes that weren't implemented. So anyway, I'm getting off this bandwagon, and we're now going to get into where we actually with the tariffs. So April 2nd, April 3rd was probably our biggest day recently as far as understanding where everything sits. I'll just say, for the deep breath of this group, our industry was mostly unaffected. That at the end of the day, the tariffs that the U.S. were threatening were not implemented in the way that they were expected. Now, that being said, for any manufacturers here, something to be mindful of is that we've been working in almost like a favored nation type of trade interaction. So most of your brokers, when they go, they're paying the 2% oftentimes instead of going through the paperwork required to go through the CUMSA agreement exemptions. So that is something, I'll kind of get into it a little bit later, but having a good relationship with your broker is maybe one of the best suggestions I can give, is they are the expert in that realm. I've talked to many of them. Some are really good, and some I frankly think are lost because they've never had to deal with this. And adaptation to this particular change, I think, is really challenging. It's I think we've gotten lazy about how trade works. That we've found some really good shortcuts, and we've been just kind of dealing with it. So at the moment, when it comes to the broad tariff on Canada, we're exempt. Um, Automobiles did go into effect, so expect that any cars that we sell into Canada get that extra 25%. And then we went ahead and rebutted that with our own, which is just copying the US at the moment. So cars are just going to be expensive. And then the one that impacts this room probably the most, and I have a whole slide kind of dedicated to a deeper dive of this conversation because it's actually really complicated between Canada and the US in our differences on how we applied steel and aluminum. But both of those are in effect. So like I said, bear with me. There's a different conversation when it comes to derivatives of materials that's really important to kind of understand that dynamic, but I'll go into that. So next and upcoming, semiconductors are currently threatened. So there's a series of upcoming tariffs that are likely on the horizon. They're in what's called investigation. And I think that's actually interesting because all the tariffs we've been kind of dealing with in this reactive way for the last couple months have been under the guise of what's called the IEEPA, or the International's Economic Powers Act. And that gave the Trump administration unilateral power to make decisions on the fly without any Senate or House approval, and with the idea of there being a judicial review. That is probably one of the more interesting things that happened last week, is the decision to start looking at what's called a 232 tariff. So that requires an investigation period. So that's what we're seeing on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, not this Venezuelan oil one. That's actually a bit different. But there's also softwood lumber and copper. Those are all going to go through what's kind of the formal tariff process. So you either have a 232 or 301 type of tariff, and there are different requirements, but ultimately that means we're now going to get a little bit more bandwidth on those ones being implemented. I honestly have no idea why that shift in gears has happened, but I'd say that's a good thing for the world collectively, is that we get a bit more time to react to this, because the uncertainty arguably has been one of the more detrimental items to this conversation, is constantly being on your toes about what the next thing is. So countries purchasing Venezuelan oil is in effect. That went into effect March 24th. Via executive order, which I'll be honest, at this point, understanding how executive orders actually play out is kind of complicated, because it first means you have to understand who owns the responsibility of that. As far as I can tell, because of the IEEPA, this tariff should be in effect. So if Canada starts buying our oil from Venezuela for some reason, because we're having a hard time producing enough and processing it, because we box ourselves out of the US, we decide to buy it from Venezuela, we could see that we've got another 25% on all products. I don't see that happening yet, and I haven't heard any word from the Canadian government that that is the direction they'd like to go, but know that that's there at least. Next is timber, lumber, and derivatives. So again, I kind of want to talk about derivatives later, but just for definition's sake, derivatives are anything you use that material to make. So if I make a wood window, that is a derivative of a lumber material. So that would be included as part of that tariffing. And then copper is also under investigation. I mentioned coming soon for timber and lumber. I think every bit of indication that I see is they are talking about implementation for that late 2025. We've gotten enough word on that I'm pretty comfortable that you should expect 34.5% on any lumber at the end of this year as additional tariff on wood that we sell down to the US. For counter tariffs by Canada, so those are any goods that are being sold from the US into Canada. The first phase was about $30 billion worth of material. Fairly simple as far as the items on that list, with the exception of completed vinyl and wood windows. Again, for this room, it's really not germane. But for kind of the overall fenestration industry, what I see happening is, because we're boxing or we're adding an additional cost to those windows, what we are likely to see is more imports to Canada, because there is now a space that has been created by boxing out some of those U.S. counterparts. We've been having conversations in the background at Fenestration Canada about compliance and about subsidizing, or windows that are being subsidized or dumped within our country. So I expect that to get worse because of the way we've managed the counter tariffs, which kind of leads me to, we also have steel and aluminum, but it's not derivatives. So that's important. We're not talking about aluminum windows and doors that are completed that are shipped over the border. That should not be included as part of the tariffing at the border. So if we produce it here, we ship it down to we are buying aluminum windows or doors from the US and bringing it into Canada, that should not be affected. And then the last is cars. Yeah, again, just expensive. So now I'm going to get into some of the navigating the border conversation. I get maybe 2 or 3 emails a day on different scenarios that people are dealing with when it comes to HS codes or how they're supposed to interpret certain things. And, I haven't done a proper disclaimer in this conversation. If you don't know me, I am not an accountant, lawyer, or broker, which I think all 3 experts should be in the room. That if you get into really specific conversations about it, you need them. But this is what I've learned talking with them. So as far as, I'm going to go through some critical concepts first, and I'm going to use a little bit of the next few slides to unpack those topics. It'll get a little bit into, call it strategies, but for the most part, what I'm trying to do with these is just educate on kind of the basics of some of the words and what they mean, because the border kind of has its own language. It has its own rule sets. It's kind of its own little ecosystem, frankly. And as I mentioned before, some of the changes that have happened are new to almost everyone, that the brokers are still trying to figure out what those next few steps look like. So first is Incoterms. And I know that in previous presentations, I've really harked on this, and I cannot express this enough. Incoterms, come back. So Incoterms are the international commercial terms, and they are legally binding terms that you can use in your contracts and your language that help set very clear understanding of who owns what portion of the process. And that is so critical, because I fully expect that there is going to be, I fully expect, I've had instances of people coming back and saying, I was charged for this tariff, but it has nothing to do with my product. Like a good example, we've had spacer bar companies that have reached out, and they have like super spacers, for instance. No metal in it. There is no reason at the moment why a super spacer without metallic content should be tariffed, but the broker didn't manage it correctly, and so they put the wrong HS code there. So anyway, like I said, I'll get into that, but there are terms specifically that we're going to go over. Then obviously HS, or a harmonized commodity description code system. This is the overall code system, or these are the item numbers that are associated to literally every product in the world, or every product that could be generated. And the HS system is evaluated every 5 years for any technology improvements, any type of changes that would add additional items or concepts to items. Substantial transformation is a huge topic, and we'll kind of get into that as we get into what are some of the strategies that people can use if they're, say, buying IGUs from the US and manufacturing in Canada and then shipping those products back to the US. And then we'll talk about derivatives and material dominance. Again, that's a huge topic on the aluminum side because the difference between a derivative and not having the derivative is the difference between like I've got a steel reinforcing I'm going to sell, but I add that steel reinforcing to my frame, and do I now constitute as a as having a product of derivative, and that has to do with material dominance. And anyway, we'll get there. So let's see. Don't go too far. There we go. All right. So in total, there is about 11 formal Incoterms that you could be using. And so Incoterms are going to help you kind of walk from the beginning of your responsibility all the way to the product being unloaded from a truck and on site. So you're going to have your variety of I have the material, and who then is responsible for putting that material on the truck, and then from that truck to the border, who is responsible for that transportation, and then from the border, who is dealing with customs, who's managing that process, who's paying for the customs. That all can be defined by Incoterms. So I know that I'm harking on it, but I cannot insist enough that if you don't already have these clearly outlined and that you don't have a paper process trailing that needs to be a focus. So I've got two examples, pretty common ones. So like FOB or free onboard. Your responsibility as the seller is I'm going to load the trucks, or I'm going to load the goods onto the truck. And that is it. That should be the extent of my responsibility. I'm not managing the customs clearance. I'm not managing the insurance for it. Ultimately, they've got the truck. They're bringing it. So that's what FOB actually means. And then I've got DAP, or delivered at place. And come back. There's this funny delay. So delivered at place is maybe a bit more common to how like a residential window is going to be shipped down to the States. You're going to wind up loading those windows into the truck. Either I have the truck or I've hired the truck. I'm responsible for it. I'm paying for the insurance. But a term like delivered at place means I don't manage the customs clearance. That's not my responsibility. I'm not going to be paying import duties and taxes. If I've provided that in my paperwork to my customer, and I've provided that to the broker, and the broker provides that to the border, that should all work. But if there's any confusion in that, what will likely happen is that I will be the last person I've worked with my broker on, and he will put me as the import of what's it called? Import of record. Thank you. Import of record, and then I find myself with the bill for customs, and then we've got to have a conversation with our customer on who's going to pay this. I expect that confusion to happen. I've been hearing about that confusion happening. So for HS codes, this is a little mixed up, but anyway, so for HS codes, this was the list of counter tariffs and I say this was the list. These were the handful of items that were directly impacting our industry before April 2nd. That we had, I had 25 different harmonized codes that were associated to our industry. I could not find an item that was not going to impact us. That was a huge conversation when we got to the Department of Finance. We went after float glass specifically. So, as a bit of an update for this group, we've sent out a few letters, but just so everyone here knows, we hired a lobbyist at Fenestration Canada in order to go have a conversation in Ottawa about this. We heard from manufacturers, and I'll be honest, as soon as I saw float glass on the list, I freaked out. That I could not think of anything more detrimental to Canadian manufacturers than having float glass tariffed. We don't manufacture it, and we have not manufactured float glass in 33 years, and we buy 90% of it from the US. We currently manufacture, as far as I could tell, about 80% of our own IGUs in Canada. But float glass was a non-starter. So we had a meeting with the director at the Department of Finance, which is the person that provides the recommendation to the ministers on what is appropriate as far as that counter tariff list was concerned. His comment to us was that the argument we made for flow class made sense. That it definitely fell under the category of items that they did not want to counter tariff. So as far as I can tell, that suggestion was given to the ministers, and then this became irrelevant. Because as soon as the tariffs in the U.S. side dropped, then we didn't worry about this. There is a public comments period coming, is what we've been told. I just got a message from our lobbying firm maybe 3 hours ago or so. As far as the current government's concerned, it looks like it's a lot of posturing between the two political candidates on what they want to do in the future. I'm hopeful we'll get a public comment period on what they want to do next as far as counter tariffs, but the language from the Department of Finance has been that they really would like to steer away from counter tariffs as a, call it, method of combating the U.S. trade deficit or trade issues. So I've got my HS code items a little mixed up. I was going to go through, I can explain a little bit of what this is. Ultimately, my highlight here is that there is 5,600 HS codes. You've got essentially this big compendium of all of the HS codes. There are national specific codes. One of the best things I can suggest is that if you're confused about which items are being tariffed at the moment, the CBSA, or our Canadian Border Control, actually has a tariff finder site. And so you can look up roughly the composition and the type of item that you have, and it'll bring up that HS code. And then you can click on it. It'll tell you whether or not it's being tariffed and at what rate. So that's probably, like, as far as you're concerned, that's one of the best resources I found as I was going through this whole conversation, just so you kind of know what that looks like. Okay, so substantial transformation. One of the interesting things you can do is you can do what's called a foreign goods returned at the US side. And so that means that I've got glass that I buy from the US, I bring it into Canada, and then I'm planning to send that glass back to the US, ideally in a frame. The problem is that in order for me to use foreign goods returned, or a duty defer, or a duty, we'll get to the slide here in just a moment, but in order for me to go through the couple mechanisms that the Canadian government and the US government have given me, or given us, is it can't go through substantial transformation. The moment I put that glass into that frame, that becomes a new HS code. And the substantial transformation no longer that HS code is no longer valid under a foreign goods returned. Again, I kind of want to go into the details here in just a moment, but that's, the moment that you have substantially changed something, it might change which tariff code is applied to it. Again, kind of goes back to derivatives, but. So getting into derivatives. If I've got a window in the US that I am selling into Canada, or there's a manufacturer in the US that's selling into Canada, the window itself is not going to be tariffed. If they were just selling the profile here, or they were just selling a metallic portion of that item, then it would get tariffed. So another good example, if you're buying call it spacer bar from the US, that would be tariffed, but the IGU you're using those spacer bars for are not. Now, I go into the US, or So from Canada, if I've got a window that has that glass in, it is considered a derivative of the steel and aluminum tariffs. That aluminum window selling from Canada into the US would be tariffed. And if I had a IGU that I make here, then that would be tariffed. So it would be a derivative item of the metallic or from the steel and aluminum tariff. Yeah, so the derivatives only on the US side. And so this is where, that's why I wanted to focus on this, is it's just really confusing. On the Canadian side, we don't include derivatives. On the US side, they do. And so that means in Canada, if you've got something selling into, it has to be metallic. It can't be like a composite of that material. Like I don't trigger a window that has glass and spacer bar and gaskets and the whole bit. Like that HS code, regardless, like that is no longer a derivative of the metal. Now I really should say this. The border, as far as I can tell, is very subjective. That the border guard in the U.S. and the border guard in Canada get to determine whether or not it meets all of these rules. So that there are rules that they can refer back to, but at the end of the day, they get final say. They're like almost like our authority having jurisdiction.
Wow. So like a fabricated glass product from the U.S. into Canada gets a tariff.
So a glass product that's going from Canada into the U.S. gets a tariff. No. If the material is not substantial. So there's something called material dominance. So if you can prove that the volume of the material is not dominant, either by volume or by purpose, you can prove that you don't have material dominance. So let's say spacer bar. I had a great conversation the other day with a manufacturer who has a composite spacer bar. So they've got a mixed fiberglass steel spacer bar. If they can prove that the amount of fiberglass in that spacer bar is a greater volume than the amount of metal that they used in it, it does not constitute under the tariff. Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of my definition of these couple things. I think it's important for you to know as you're kind of hitting those conversations. I know it's confusing. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how important brokers are and finding a good broker, because I have had 2.5, 3 months to go down this rabbit trail, and I'd rather go back into commercial glazing. You guys, and I thought that was complicated, to be totally honest. I felt like a good curtain wall system kind of breaks my brain. But yeah, anyway. So there's some basic strategies as far as I'm concerned when it comes to managing the border. One of the easiest ones is managing your contract additions. I cannot emphasize enough, and I know that having experience mostly on the multifamily side, I really beat onto contract management. It is so important your terms are delineated. So Incoterms, as I mentioned, if you don't have that called out, it's important to start considering it as part of your entire chain of paperwork. Non-payment consequences. So going back to the conversation of, it's likely that there's going to be mistakes at the border when it comes to your broker providing information, the interpretation at the Canadian Border Patrol. I think if you have anything that is other than wipe my hands and walk away from the material once it gets put onto a truck, there are going to be moments when you get unfair duties applied. I think that's just the truth of our reality. So if you don't have like a non-payment clause built in, I think you're putting yourself in a place where you don't have explicit instructions to your buyer on what happens when I have it, or what happens when you don't pay it. Because you can set those terms, you can get that clear, but I think being clear about that is critical. And then explicit duty payment responsibility. I feel like that's probably me beating a dead horse, but you should probably call out who owns responsibility, even if you have the Incoterms there. All right, so some general strategies. One of my favorite and kind of the easiest to do is break out your transportation costs. They are not tariffable, or you can't apply duties to transportation. So if you make sure that's broken out in your invoices to the border, that actually won't get tariffed, but you have to break it out. And so that is a lot of times for the manufacturers I've talked to, that's not a practice they currently do, that they include their shipping and any of their transportation costs included as part of the price. It's important that you break it out. Otherwise, you're going to be paying duties on that as an inclusion to the HS codes associated to the products. This is probably more to do with my own personal background. I think when you hit moments of severe change like this, it is so critical to sit down with your team and create a strategy on how you're going to manage this. I think for my own teams, we'd be having a conversation about what our supply chain is, what are the risks associated with our current supply chain, how do we need to shift gears on that, how do I change my accounting to now include some of the breakouts that I'm going to have to do, what does my paper trail look like throughout my company and to my customers. Like those would all be things I'd be sitting down with a full day with my team to have that conversation. And so take that as an unasked for opinion. And then again, talk with a broker. They're the professional in this whole circle. And if anybody wants broker suggestions, let me know. I've got a list of people that I've now talked to, and I can send that your way. All right. So when it comes to supply, like you're buying your supply from the US and you're doing your project in the US. I kind of talked about it earlier, but you've got what's called foreign goods returned, or HTS 9801. So that is, I'm buying this IGU. I'm going to make the window frame. I'm going to put the IGU next to the window frame so that they look at each other nicely as they travel over the border. And now I can claim foreign goods returned on that IGU. So the moment that I put that IGU into the frame, though, it has gone through substantial transformation and it no longer works. So there's also the duty drawback for re-exported US components. That doesn't have the same substantial completion requirements. And you can actually do both the foreign goods returned and the duty drawback at the same time. So that's called a K32. I had this really interesting example where I had a manufacturer reach out that they wanted to see if the resin they were buying from the US could be exempted using the duty drawback. And the answer was yes, but what you need to do is use what's called a K32A, which is the importer of the resin is going to give me a form that says that they are not going to be the ones that re-export that to the US. They give me the responsibility to do so. And then I can take the value of that resin and then include that as part of my paperwork. It is wildly bureaucratic to go through the process of avoiding the tariffs. And I guess that's actually the point I'm trying to make. There's also duty deferral programs. So in the event that you're buying that material and you're going to sell it back to the US, you can avoid the taxes incurred, like duties, taxes, at the border. So essentially what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to defer the taxes on these items. I have up to 24 months to take that item, remanufacture it, send it back over the border. Now I don't have to pay the duties and taxes on that. The Canadian government would recommend these over what I'll talk about next, which is the remission process. And then to kind of wrap up this whole thought process, obviously many manufacturers are going to try to figure out how to manage what visual costs are applied to what the border gets. It's one of the easiest things for us to do is to talk about how do I decrease the visual cost to the border so that I don't get tariffed on as much of it. So the only legal way to do that is what's called a 2-invoice strategy. So that means that I am going through the foreign goods returned, and I then am going to take an invoice and I can send that to my customer that shows one cost. And then I've got another invoice that shows the border that I am only exempting the cost of my goods for the IGU, and the frame has this profit margin that's going to be attached to the same invoice before. But on the invoice to my customer, I can include all kinds of different things. That is a legal process. Like I can do that. So. And then last but not least is transfer pricing. So if I happen to have a company both in the US and Canada, I can sell myself those goods from my Canadian counterpart to my US counterpart at whatever margins make the most amount of sense. Then I'm kind of just dealing with whatever, call it cost of goods, is appropriate. That being said, there is a whole list in the background for the Canadian and US border that they have averages of what is expected from different industries. And then they also have your history of what you've been trading in the past. So if you have a fairly robust history, and you start decreasing your costs substantially, they are going to flag you. And then there's going to be a larger conversation. I had the expert from the BDO. I had a conversation with her. It was one of her risks that she said, be very careful about how you manage that. So when it comes to strategies for import into Canada outside of the duty drawback and duty deferral, there is tariff remission. So tariff remission is a lot like getting the HS code removed. The difference is that it can be applied either to a company specifically or an industry specifically. So this is a process Fenestration Canada is actually going through right now, is that we are putting in for remission for float glass in the event that float glass HS code still maintains. I'm looking for feedback right now from manufacturers on what else you would like to see remit. I will admit I am going to be very conservative about that conversation because, as a good example, one of the, call it thought experiments we went down, was the idea of removing the HS code on IGUs. So in the event that we did have the tariffs applied, what we were going to be up against was the US was going to be tariffing any of the IGUs from Canada being sold in the US. And then if we had removed the IGUs, we actually would have given a competitive advantage to the US selling into Canada. Because we produce nearly 80% of our own, that's probably a bad deal for us. So it's tricky. It's really a tricky situation. That being said, like resin is a great example. We have one resin manufacturer in Canada that might be one that is a good remission solution, but I want that input. Frankly, I kind of need it from the manufacturers. I think more than anything, I've been really appreciative of all the feedback I've been getting. I know this has been turbulent for everyone, but that feedback is essential. I literally can't do this type of work without it. So, okay. So, as far as Fenestration Canada is concerned, I drafted up a kind of a pillar solution for how we were going to be thinking about these trade problems. And, it really is more of a longer term strategy on what we want to see moving forward. So I've got 4 pillars that we're focused on. So first is safeguarding and improving our fenestration supply chain. So this work with removing the float glass, that's very much under that category. An example of one that we're still in discovery period is how do we support float glass manufacturing in Canada? Like, again, I said at the beginning, we haven't manufactured in 33 years. That has to be fixed. Next is improving fenestration manufacturing. So what that really entails is we need to figure out how to capture our market back in Canada. That I'm kind of expecting that we're going to get import stresses because of all the trade differences that we have. I mean, just even without our 25%, the rest of the world just got tariffed. And so they're going to be looking for new markets. Not to put any, concern about competitions in our minds, but I'm expecting that's one of our spaces that we have to fight for the next six months plus. Protecting members from unfair trade practices. Again, we've been hearing anecdotal, mostly, references to unfair trade practices, people coming into our market that are just dumping containers of windows and then they show up on site and they don't have labels and so on and so forth. So the first step there that we've actually executed on is a non-compliance form on our website. So if you find yourself in a situation that you do have concerns about a product that's in the market, I want to hear about it. And nothing more than right now we're doing data collection. So the more of that information I can get, the better we can kind of shape an argument around it. I think there's longer term things we can do here, but at the end of the day, a lot of the initiatives we put into place are 2 months old from kind of the moment that we were starting to think about this. So there's quite a few that are in discovery period that I really need to talk with the board more and get approval before we get to the AGM, and then we'll have a bit more of a wrap up on that. And then last is decreasing non-value cost. I know it's a bit of a nitpicky thing for me, but the idea that we have a series of standards that may not be serving us, they either need to be reevaluated or we need to figure out how to change them in such a way that we aren't getting, I don't want to get too far into that conversation because that's very much opinionated at this point. But I think we've got a series of standards and regulations that we're probably adding cost to our industry unnecessarily. So yeah, and that kind of wraps up my conversation. So I'm going to leave it to questions. Please poke at me.
So Adrian joined us in September of last year. A great addition. Can you imagine how grateful I am today that he joined us in September of last year? It was somewhere around December. We're having a conversation. I said, hey, can you look into this tariff thing that they're talking about? And off he ran with it. So any questions for Adrian?
Thank you, Adrian, for the presentation. I truly appreciate it because I know you must not be an expert in this international business. So actually, I worked in Pilkington companies for 17 years in China. So I'm familiar with the float glass and familiar with the international business. So do you agree that for the Fenestration, for the glass industry in Canada, the crucial problem in the next few years, maybe it's still not this tariff problem, but the supply chain?
Yes.
Yeah, because in my experience in this float glass industry, the supply in United States is limited. They have limited float factories in the United States. And if Trump's tariff works, the manufacturing in the United States will increase substantially. And with the tariff in USA, and I think the glass will not, less and less of glass can be imported to the United States. So for the float glass manufacturer in the USA, so they will reduce the export to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a crucial part from the supply chain in Canada.
I wholly agree. And it's one of the initiatives that admittedly I was hoping the last couple of weeks I'd be able to focus on. I've been gathering feedback from our suppliers just so I can get a list together for Fenestration Canada's benefit of what the different supply options are, even within our own membership. You know, like what can we do even within this circle? But the supply chain on float glass, we don't have a short-term solution.
Yeah,
like even if somebody was shovel ready to put up a factory, the furnaces take 3 years.
3 to 5 years to
Yeah.
build a new factory.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's almost impossible for Canada to build a new factory in the next few years.
Yeah.
Not even to get into the whole soda ash conversation of that, which is the majority of the soda ash in North America is coming from Wyoming.
Yeah.
So we could potentially use potash, but that's not a process that that's not what you use for glass. That's just not been the practice.
So under that circumstance, maybe the glass will come from maybe Mexico, maybe Europe, maybe Asia.
Maybe,
But
yeah.
it all depends on water.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And, I'm really encouraged. One thing I didn't mention, after that conversation with the director of the Department of Finance, we had the minister at the Department of Housing, Infrastructure, and Communities reach out to us to let us know the float glass problem was something they're flagging as a major issue. So, I think between them and then the chief of staff at Doug Ford's group reached out to have a conversation in the future about what Ontario can do to support. I think we've got the right ears at this moment to start thinking a little bit more on what that looks like. Obviously, Canada is going to be very invested into what it means to build our own, but that's like we're just talking about, that's a 3 to 5 year process. Even if somebody had all the permits done, shovel ready, plant goes in. There's no question that we're going to have to look at import opportunities for glass in the short term if the uncertainties continue. And this is kind of a problem I have, is that we were having this conversation back in 2021 when the supply chain got disrupted and things went back to normal and we all went back to sleep because it is so hard to fix this problem. So no, you're nailing, I think, the core of our next bit of problems is our supply chain is going to have to shift.
Yeah.
So, Adrian, is the government ready to have conversations shifting from zero carbon, as Jomo,
Thanks. Sorry.
to
Full carbon?
smart carbon involvement, and recognize that manufacturing may hurt the environment, but overall it's better?
I would love for the answer to be yes, right? It's like, let's prioritize the things that matter. But man, some of this stuff is on a train with momentum. How do you derail it? Like, and I think it's critical, but I think things will have to break before some of the, call it net carbon, net zero changes actually come off the rails, and that becomes irrelevant. Like sitting in the national code meetings, I can tell you those guys are diehard. They are not getting off that train without being shot in the head first. So, like I'd love the answer to be yes. We're going to be adaptive in Canada, but
I think we won't have a choice at some point. I mean,
yeah.
if we talk about glass supply, and if the U.S. becomes strained on their float glass capacity, they're not going to be shipping it to us, no matter
Yeah.
what the tariff is. So at some point,
It's just, is the pain
Yeah.
so far down that you can't?
tell an environmentalist he can't have windows for his new house and see what he says.
Yeah.
No matter
that
what they are.
that becomes the trigger.
Well, what gets me is the calculations that include, oh, terrible for all this transport carbon.
yeah.
Like, well, we didn't have to have it.
Yeah, for sure. Anybody else?
Thank you. We also can add that any service that you do charge to your customer across the border is not being tariffed. It's only the goods.
That's right.
And we heard from some customers that they were trying to charge more management project fees. All the time you spend designing your projects, sourcing the goods, that's a lot of hours. And today these hours of yours and of your teams, they are in your margins on the goods for like most of the players here. And they could definitely be charged differently on the invoices that you are sending away. And that could be a good way to reduce the impact of those tariffs.
Are you an accountant?
I'm not.
No, but
It just sounds like, hey, I got an idea
he's
here.
nailing a critical element here, which is
We do source goods and we are selling them to OEM manufacturers in Canada who face the issues. So just talking with the customers, it's a path to
Yeah.
do some savings. And there is also the exchange rate. And at least for people who do sell to the US, the value of the US good that you're getting is better than before if you are Canadian expenses. So it's not so. I mean, I hope we could live long enough to resist to this difficult period of our time. But yes, trying to even charging the quotes, the quotations that you do as well, making some agreements with some of your customers could also be helpful. Some architects do that. Why we couldn't do it in the fenestration industry as well. And China is, I'm sure, a good potential partner. We also benefit from a European free trade agreement. And that's, I think, everybody heard about these free trade agreement the last years, but the weight of habits maybe didn't let you so far take some advantages from this free trade agreement. I think even if the tariff stops tomorrow, it's maybe a source that you could start to look into a little bit more. We have some European standards or regulations were mentioned today. They don't make the best windows or doors of the world, but they do have good manufacturers as well over that. And I think it's also a place where we could try to try to diversify our business on trade, generally speaking.
So I agreed completely on the last portion. National dependence or national independence from supply chains is also, I mean, it's both and. Like we both need the infrastructure investments so that we can be producing our own, but short term, we're not going to accommodate for the 78% of total GDP that we import from the US. Just one comment too, I completely agree. Services are not included as part of something that is tariffable. That being said, again, going back to my comment earlier, if you have a history of a value for a product as it's hitting the border, you now have kind of your own smoking gun if you start breaking that up too much. And so just be very mindful if you start doing that, you might start getting some hard questions. And I wish I could tell you today how the border is going to handle it. But my guess would be, based off of what I talked to the woman from the BDO on, it is something that they are flagging. And they will send it back and say, well, that doesn't make sense because you've been trading this way for the last however so many years that you've been trading over the border.
So you can't say your windows are 10,000 and the shop drawings are 90,000? Makes sense to me. I got auto first.
Yeah, earlier you were talking about what might be tariffed going back to the U.S. and I wasn't sure if you were talking about due to the steel and aluminum tariffs, like there's a certain amount of content. Is there fenestration products, be it IGU or windows, manufactured windows that you feel are currently threatened by the existing steel and aluminum tariffs?
Yeah, so for Canadian-made products, the only thing that is going to be affected right now is any steel or aluminum products. So, and that is steel and aluminum specific products, not their derivatives. So the only things that are impacted right now, like that's impacted in Canada. For the US, it is wood windows, vinyl windows, and and derivatives. Sorry, other way around. If you buy US,
Sorry. Yeah,
So,
fair enough.
if you're selling a window or a sealed unit into the U.S. and it's a combination of manufactured goods, then that would be considered derivative, would not be subject to tariffs currently.
correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's easier for me to ask direct questions at this point. I get myself confused easily.
So, gentlemen on my left, thank you for your comments. Just a real quick, real world example. Our company makes product in Mexico, in the US, and we have a plant in Brampton, Ontario. And we're looking at possibly transferring our US product into Brampton at our base raw cost, which would reduce our tariffs, and then we would pass those savings along. So that's one example of how that might work.
Yeah, and that's called transfer pricing, just to.
Okay, one more if somebody's got one. If not, we're going to bring Murray up and get into our next session. Going once. Got time for one more. All right. Thanks, Adrian. Such great work, man. Thank you so much.